The first draft open is just over a week away, so welcome to Draft Boot Camp. Hello, everyone, and welcome to FECast episode 67, Draft Boot Camp. The first draft open of the 2021 season, the first of three, is going to be in just over a week, and I am really looking forward to it after the draft open, or the draft ECQ, or whatever that tournament was last year. I was really looking forward to more competitive draft, and we are getting that this year. So that is really exciting. I am, of course, Sunyveil. With me is someone who qualified for Worlds in that draft tournament last year. Welcome, Stormblessed.
Hello, as always, glad to be here, and very much looking forward to draft. It's coming up very soon, and I hope we can give people who may not have as much experience with drafting a bit of a brief rundown on some just fundamental principles they should be aware of.
So today's podcast is going to be for the people that usually listen to our cast that probably have a bunch of constructed tournament experience and know how draft works, but might not be draft experts or someone that drafts regularly. And there's a lot of conflicting opinions out there with regards to draft. Everyone says that they're good at draft, and they will also say, when you point that out, when everyone says that they're good at draft, they might say that they actually are. But in any case, there's a lot of information out there, and we're going to bring to you the stuff that we think is rock solid and not something that is too controversial. To help us with this process is the most prolific writer about Eternal Draft and our honored guest for today's show, Schaab. Welcome back to the show. It's great to have you here.
Hey guys, really excited to be back. Thank you for the invitation. As you know, I am always ready to talk about draft. So yeah, thanks for having me.
In case you don't know who Schaab is, they write quite a bit at letstalklimited.com and on Eternal Warcry. There are some fantastic articles, and I'm not one to recommend articles very frequently, but if you haven't read these, I would definitely give them a read. The three of them that I picked out that I think are really, really good reads and really enlightening are It's Time to Draft the Hard Way, Be Boring with regards to drafting and building better decks, and their article on Quadrant theory. I think all of those are excellent reads, and they'll be linked in the description of this cast.
I would just like to reiterate that specifically the first one Sonny mentioned, It's Time to Draft the Hard Way. Schaab reminded me of that principle, of that idea, and backed it up with some examples in Eternal. And without having read the article, I do not think I would have qualified for Worlds in the draft tournament, because I remembered that I needed to draft the hard way, and so I ended up drafting, my least favorite archetype in the format and built the best version of the archetype in the format. And it was a great deck. And if I hadn't read that article and remembered how the ideas of this and learned from Schaab, I don't think I would have made Worlds in the draft format.
Well, I really appreciate the kind words, and hearing that people have been successful after reading my work is like the best thing that I can hear. So yeah, that's awesome. I'm really glad. It was funny because you talked about how much you hated Fire in that draft format when I was on the show, and then you ended up drafting Fire, or you had already done it. So, but yeah, congrats on the top 8. Cool.
You can go back to hear that in the last cast. But yeah, being disciplined, taking the card, even if you don't want to take it, it really helped my game.
So on today's show, we're going to cover a few topics: drafting the tournament-winning deck, basically how to make sure your draft goes as well as planned; gameplay for when you're actually in the game to maximize your chances, specific to the draft format and how it may differ from playing in constructed; and preparation, which I think is a big part of draft. I mean, when we're talking about limited tournaments, I think a lot of people might think, oh, you just show up and see what happens. But I think preparation is a huge part of doing well in draft tournaments, and any other tips that we might have. And to close out the episode, as always, Stormblessed is going to give you the rundown of important dates to remember. Anyway, let's get started with drafting the tournament-winning deck. Stormblessed, do you want to go over this first point?
Yeah, so one of the most basic, and then obviously everything gets more complicated from here, but the most basic idea is that you want to pick the best card in the pack. And that sounds obvious, and there's obviously a lot of intricacies there, but basically, especially if you're trying to draft a tournament-winning deck list, you don't want to take the odd card, the fun card, the meme card, the super edge case cards. Those have a place in decks, but those place, especially if you're new to drafting, is for people that have drafted super heavily and know when the edge cases come up. And so just like, if you see like a pyrotechnic explosion or like, another card that's a meme card and then an uncommon slot, right? Maybe just take the pyrotech explosion, just move on with life and, take the good card of the pack and don't try to get too clever and fancy about things.
And one thing that I want to make mention of, one of the things that makes drafts so interesting is that we can't even agree like on when we say the best card in the pack. Do you take the most powerful card or do you take a slightly less powerful card that goes in more decks? So like when I look at a pack and I think of the best card, there is, like the best card in a vacuum. And if a card is so powerful that it kind of dwarfs everything else, I will certainly first pick it. But usually when I'm looking at the best card in a pack, I'm trying to find a card that goes into a wide variety of decks.
For me, one of the best examples of this is Impending Doom. 5/5 flying, one faction. There's a lot of things going on here. It just attacks and blocks, but hey, attacking and blocking is a great way to win. It's got evasion, so hitting them for 5 a turn and it's difficult to block. It can get removed, that's true. And it's only one faction, which means that it will make a lot of your decks. I mean, multi-faction cards are fun and exciting and cool and often very powerful. But one of the great things about Impending Doom is that it will go in every shadow deck and it will be fantastic in it. I mean, just having a card that can attack and block every turn, a 4-cost 4/4 on the ground even, or like a 3-cost 3/3, those are good cards. Just because they're not flashy doesn't mean they're not good. And I think that goes along with this, with being the best card in the pack a lot, even if there is like a really neat amplify spell, like is it Mighty Strikes or Wild Strikes, the one with amplify?
Yeah, Mighty Strikes.
The fire primal
Mighty
one
Strike,
with amplify.
Yeah, Mighty Strikes.
For those who don't know, Mighty Strikes is a 3 fire primal for give a unit +2/+2 and overwhelm, and there's amplify 2 to give a unit +2/+2 and overwhelm. So for 5 costs, you can give 2 units +2/+2 and overwhelm, or you can give 1 unit +4/+4 and overwhelm. And back when that was flipped, when it was 2 costs with 3 amplify, it was probably the best card in the format. You just like forced the Mighty Strikes deck every time in the original format that it was in with Renown specifically, and it was absurd. In this current format, it's not quite as good, but it's still exceptionally powerful. But what Sunny is saying is, even if the card is in some respects maybe a higher power level than maybe the rare of a mono faction card, although I wouldn't probably take over Impending Doom, but let's say, it was lesser than Impending Doom, you might still want to take the Impending Doom, pack 1, pick 1, or the equivalent card because it's single faction.
Yeah.
I actually think that one of the big pitfalls of a lot of drafts is that people, the example, I really like the example that you gave. Impending Doom is a rare on such a power level that if I first pick it, chances that it will be in my final deck are extremely high. But a lot of people are hesitant to walk away from their first pick as if they first picked Impending Doom, when really the rare that they picked or the uncommon is far less powerful. But they kind of get like married to it, like subconsciously or not. They kind of warp their entire draft around it. And for something like Impending Doom that wins you the game like an extremely high percentage of the time that you cast it, it can be correct to warp your draft in that way. But I think a lot of people start with, a very good card, pack 1, and then pick 1 and then have a hard time, putting it in the sideboard or in their pool and drafting something different.
Yeah, that's where things get really tough, right? If your first pick lines up with the rest of your picks, then that makes things a lot easier, right? And that just makes life a lot easier. But that's not always going to happen. Sometimes you look at your second pack of cards, you don't have something in that works well with your first card, and you just have to take the best pick again. Because, I mean, this is perhaps another conversation, but based on signaling, which is seeing what cards are being passed your way, the first pack gives you no information as to what that is. So, like, you can't decide what lane to be in based on your first pack. It just doesn't work that way. You don't know if that lane's open or not.
Right. And for anyone, especially who may draft in different games, so in Eternal, in the way that it works right now, the pack 1 that you have, and then packs 2 and 3 are from a completely different drafter. So if you decide that you're locked in at the end of pack 1, the next 2 packs you're going to get, you just have to cross your fingers. So it's not a great place to be heading into pack 2.
One of the things you can do to mitigate that idea is if you try to stay in one faction mostly in pack 1, then in pack 2 you can find the next faction that's the most open and go to that faction. Not always works out the same way because again you have to try, as I like to say, taking the best card of the pack. So if the best card's in a different faction, like significantly better, you take the risk of having playing a better deck overall. But if you can try to stay in one faction mostly in pack 1, you can sort of get the hookup in pack 2 and 3 by being able to pivot to whichever faction is the next one that's open.
That's a strategy that I really like because if you have your 2 factions, by the way, draft decks probably want to be 2 factions most of the time. But if you have your 2 factions in pack 1, like you're taking cards evenly from both factions, one of them gets cut off completely in packs 2 and 3, then you could be in some really deep trouble. But if you just pick one faction for the first pack, then you're set up pretty well for the rest of the draft because you can expect to get more cards of that faction in pack 4. And in packs 2 and 3, you can just pick whatever other faction that you might need. It's a strategy that I like quite a bit, and I think it leads to like moderately powerful but very consistent decks. This approach works much better in formats that are not multi-faction, not heavily multi-faction, so just keep that in mind.
I agree with that approach, trying not to identify a second color until pack 2 in this format. It seems like committing too early is one of the ways that you can train wreck. So yeah, I think it's especially important right now to be open as long as possible. But to not to move us backwards, but to go back to pack 1, pick 1, I was wondering if I could talk about one of the first things I think everyone learns when they learn about drafting, which is bread, which is an acronym that no one remembers what all 5 things are, but they're the order that you're supposed to pick cards in. They're bombs, removal, evasion. Oh, what are the last 2?
Attackers, defenders.
Attackers, defenders. Oh, okay, great. I never think about the last 2 because so bread is perfectly fine. It's good to think about like pack 1, pick 1. Yeah, you should take bombs. If there are no bombs, you should take removal because that effect is unique. If there's no removal, sure, take an evasive unit. The reason that this is fine pack 1, but I recommend that people move away from sort of like this bread framework is because you're evaluating each card individually when really you should be drafting your deck as a whole. So it's not just a collection of cards. You're drafting a deck with a plan that has roles that need to be filled. So yeah, pack 1, pick 1. Maybe you're taking the removal over the evasive unit. But in pack 3 or pack 4, maybe you have a ton of interaction, but you have no units. And so you really just need to take attackers or defenders, even though the acronym says to take removal.
As far as bread goes, I've always been more along the lines of it should be berated. That is to say, bombs, then evasive units, then removal, then attackers, then tricks, then defenders. But that's, I guess that's a personal preference. Yeah, I mean, it tells you the relative power level of things. Good cards that can attack several times and win the game are better than removal, which will help you stay alive and help prolong the game, at least in my opinion. I mean, you can say that removal is better than evasive units, like powerful evasive units. But in any case, but like attackers and defenders, curve fillers on the ground is definitely a lot worse than removal as far as the first pick goes.
It also depends on the quality of the card too, right? If you're, if it's like, a 4-cost 3/3 flyer versus, if it was like, let's say like Desecrate was in draft packs, right? Would you take the 4-cost 3/3 flyer or 2-cost kill any unit? 2-cost kill unit might be just better than the 4-cost 3/3 flyer because it's just so efficient, right? So, again, it also depends on the quality of the card too.
It would have to be like Annihilate. Desecrate's 3 costs. No.
Well, okay, well, yeah, I was figuring what Desecrate cost, but another example, if you had Annihilate versus the 4-cost 3/3 flyer, you might take Annihilate because it's just so efficient. But if it was Cut Ties versus the 4-cost 3/3 flyer, then instead of the 3/3 flyer gets a lot more value because it attacks and blocks, as Sunny says, and is just a lot more efficient than a 6-cost card.
For pack 1, pick 1, I've actually never heard of the berated thing. I think that's pretty interesting. But I wanted to mention a couple of things to my constructed friends who maybe don't draft that often, because sometimes sometimes we all just need reminders. We need someone to give us friendly reminders of things that we already know. So I have a couple of messages for my friends who play Constructed, if that's okay. They seem obvious, but we drafters forget them a lot. So just a couple of reminders from your friend Schaab. Not casting your spells is the easiest way to lose. So taking really splashy, powerful cards is fun, but most of the time, those cards are not what determine games. So make sure that you can cast your spells. You usually want to be 2 colors. There are some times where you want to splash, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But make sure you can cast your spells and make sure that your curve looks like a curve. Make sure that you have 2 drops and 3 drops and 4 drops. One of the big things I think that has changed in Limited in the past few years is that the 1 drop slot used to be kind of a turn where nothing happened. And that's not really the case anymore. So depending on your deck, you might also want that spot on your curve. So pay close attention to your curve and make sure that you can cast your spells, because the margins for error are small. So yeah, just make sure you pay attention to your curve. I usually run 18 power. There are people who say to run 17. But yeah, 18 is my default, and then I kind of adjust from there. Though it's very odd for me to go up to 19. I go down to 17 power in my draft decks a lot more frequently. And one thing, just as a reminder, the rule of 3 for splashing. So in general, if you want to splash a card, which means add a card that is not in your faction. So if you're Fire and Justice and you want to splash, so add 1 primal card. General wisdom is to follow the rule of 3. So if you add 1 card, you want to have 3 sources for the card you're splashing for. So you can count a Seek Power as a source and a Bannerman as a source, and then add 1 primal source to your mana base, and that counts as 3. So for every card you add, you want to have 3, and then if you want to splash 2 cards, you want to have 4 sources. So that's the rule of 3 for splashing. In general, you only want to splash for cards that, so bombs that have a very significant impact on the game, or that fill a role in your deck that is sorely lacking. So if I have a deck that is really lacking interaction, I might splash Annihilate or, a shadow removal spell. But if I'm happy with the interaction in my deck, I won't splash Annihilate or other good cards just to keep my deck as consistent as possible. So draft really is this balance between doing powerful things, but making sure your deck functions consistently. And just like in Constructed, the easiest way to lose games is to not cast your spells. So make sure that you are thinking about your curve during draft and not getting too greedy with your power bases.
On that note, splashing and consistency note, like I've always harped on consistency. I think consistency is like my favorite thing in card games. I like being consistent whenever I can. And there's an idea, fixing makes you consistent, right? And splashing is cool. And let's say you're splashing for a big fancy time card, right? And so you're like, okay, well I could also fit in this expand the reach. But that's not what you want to be. You don't want to ever splash for your fixing. You don't want to splash for the cards that allow you to fix. You don't want to. If you're splashing time, you don't want to put expand the reach in your deck because it doesn't really help you get anywhere.
Let's talk about cards that are worth splashing for. So I think it's really important to only splash cards that you're okay not playing until the 6th or 7th turn, because as turns go by, you're more likely to hit your influence sources. So it works a lot better when you splash like bombs or removal or otherwise big effects that you can play in the late game and be happy with. Splashing for curve fillers or for just like things that set up things that you want to play in the early game or ways of drawing cards generally is not a great idea, because by the time you get to it, it's just not going to matter a lot of the time. I mean, sometimes, yeah, you'll have the requisite influence requirements, but most of the times that you're actually likely to be able to play something like that, especially if you have roundabout means of fixing, it's has to be something that will be good in the late game. So splashing Annihilate, I like. Splashing that multi-faction bomb that costs 7, I like. Splashing for the 3/3 for 3, I would definitely try to avoid.
Splashing for Barricade Basher, no.
No.
Example, probably one of the most common splashes in the current format. Just as an example, not too heavily into format theory this cast, but example, Metal Thing. Metal Thing is insane, game-winning, bomb, incredible, stabilizes the board. As far as Quadrant theory goes, if you can hit 6 power, it fills every role in Quadrant theory. It keeps you alive, it wins you the game, it breaks board stalls, does everything. And it's a 6-cost card. It's Fire Shadow, so it has relatively easy influence if you're in Stone Scar, obviously. If you're non-Stone Scar, if you're in Fire or Shadow decks, it's relatively splashable because it only has the 1 extra pip. And as somebody said, it costs 6, so you're going to have the time to draw your extra splash influence.
I think that's a really good example. Like Sunny said, you want cards that are relevant in the late game. So even cheap cards like Combust, like it costs 1, but you're never going to play it on turn 1, and I'm happy to play it on turn 10 or turn 8. So in units, I think Metal Fang is the best example in this format. And as far as spells, like Martial Efficiency is the only one that comes to mind for something that I will splash because it just leads to non-games. I can't think of too many more spells that I would splash for in this format.
Yeah. Let's talk about curve, because you also mentioned that earlier, and it's very important. You wrote an article, I forget which article this is from, but it had a very important point, which is if you are faced up against one of the best players in the world, and you listed 2 options, but one of them was like you get to curve out every single time against them, and that was much more powerful by far. I forget what it was compared against, but that is just the best way to win games the limited is play a 2-2 on 2, a 3-3 on 3, and a 4-4 on 4, and like a 4-5 or 5-5 on 5. If you do that every single game, you'll win a very large percentage of your games and it'll feel great. There are a few reasons. One, it makes sure that you use your power efficiently. That's just something that's great in all card games. But also, I think that's something that goes underappreciated is that it lets you use combat tricks. If you're ahead on board, your combat tricks are more powerful, and that's like the means for removal in a lot of limited, just because of how scarce removal tends to be. So you have to use tricks in order to act as removal. And the better your board, the better your tricks are going to be, and you can get a head start on your board position by just filling out your curve. And one other thing that goes along that is you want to be sure that the cards that you're picking and playing are cards that have a reasonable stats for their spot on the curve. For example, a 3-cost 2-2 is basically like missing curve. If you play it on turn 3, it's not very good. It's just the same as playing another 2-cost unit. Or for example, like, I don't know, a 5-cost 3-3 or something like that. So if you're playing understated units, that's a good way to also kind of miss curve in a way. So, in limited, it's just really important to have good attackers and blockers, because that's what your units are doing a lot of the time, even though that's very different from what happens in constructed, I feel.
Yeah, the example that I gave was if you were going to play 10,000 games against LSV, you could, either curve out every game, or you could have some bomb rare or mythic, and you could even pick what it was. And the point was that you're going to win many more games just taking the guarantee of curving out on turn 2, 3, 4, and 5. And the good news is you can try to replicate that by building your deck with a curve in mind. I think that those points you made were really good, especially because often the turning point in a game of limited or a big swing is the first player to double spell in a turn. That's usually pretty significant turn in a game of limited. But also, if you ignore the 2-drop slot on your curve, what happens then is you fill your deck up with, the 3-drop slot and above gets really full, and then you only cast 1 spell a turn on a lot of turns until you get to 6 power, because you just have 3 drops and you just have 4 drops. And when your opponent is playing 3 drops and 2 drops, or playing a 3-drop plus a piece of interaction like a trick, it becomes obvious pretty quickly how detrimental it is to only play 1 card a turn while your opponent is playing multiple.
That's a really good point. All right, so just to recap, make sure that you are picking powerful cards. You're picking the cards that will fit well in your deck, not just cards that are strong in a vacuum. Cards that can attack and block are great. Make sure your splashes are cards that you're okay playing in the late game. Make sure that you have a very good curve, because that's the quickest way to fall behind. And generally speaking, either bred or berated, depending on which one you want to follow, with bombs being the most powerful cards that you can take, removal second or third powerful, evasion also powerful, and then, attackers, tricks, and defenders bringing up the rear. Let's talk about gameplay. When you're actually in a game, what do you need to do in order to succeed? So I think there's a big difference in redraw decisions when it comes to Constructed and Limited. In Constructed, you're often looking for a powerful synergy in your opening hand and making sure you have all your factions. I think you still definitely want all your factions in Limited, but I think you can keep more aggressively than redrawing. Like going down to 6 in Limited is painful, especially when there's a lot of plunder, in order to help make use of an extra card, even if it's not that useful. I mean, I definitely want my factions and I want to curve if possible, but I might keep something that just doesn't do anything until I play like an impactful unit on turn 4 sometimes, if I feel like the rest of the hand is fine.
Yeah, I think that's an important note, is that you really want to keep a 7-card hand in Limited, because even like way more than Constructed, Limited comes down to a game of cards. You really want to have the card advantage in some capacity in Limited. Yes, you can get curved out, and that also gets back to what Schaab was saying about you want to have a consistent deck, you want to have conserved considerations. And the reason you want to have these is because you want to be able to keep a 7-card hand. If you don't have a good curve, you don't have a super consistent deck, you can go to 6 and then you can maybe get to your decent enough hand, but you really want to be able to keep that 7 in Limited. And the best way to be able to keep 7 in Limited is to draft a consistent deck with a good curve
that doesn't splash too ambitiously. One more thing about that is that when you plunder in Limited, like, okay, so when you're plundering in Constructed, the treasure troves or the basic power, the sigils, are worse than most cards in your deck. But in Limited, that discrepancy, they're probably still worse than most cards in your deck, but that discrepancy is a lot lower, right? Like, in Constructed, you have a ton of dual powers because your influences are all over the place. But in Limited, if you just have sigils, that's most of power bases. So you feel a lot better about changing one of your cards into a sigil if that's necessary.
So speaking of plunder notes, the basic heuristic for plunder in my mind is that in Constructed, you want to plunder for power because you want to be able to play your power every turn, and you want to be able to curve out, and you want to be able to do all your powerful things. You don't want to spend 2 to make a trove. In Limited, you want to plunder for troves because you have the time. Limited games tend to be a little bit slower, and you don't need to go as ham with efficiency. And of course, the other difference between plunder and Constructed and plunder and Limited is that in Constructed, you want to play your plunder as soon as possible, specifically because you're playing exploit, which obviously you want to play for the card, but also again because you want to be able to hit the power drops. You don't want to wait for your plunder because then you can't play your power out. But in Limited, you want to save your plunder cards if you can. Run them out if they're like cell swords that cost 3. But like if you're playing Plumbug, the 1 in a primal 1/1 flyer, so humbug, but it has summon plunder. You don't want to play that turn 1 most of the time. You just want to hold that card in your hand until either you're starting to get power shooting, you just need to make your power drops because you have to plunder for power, or you just keep waiting until you can get an extra trove off of it, because a 3-cost 1/1 flyer that says summon draw a card is so much better than a 1/1 flyer for 1 with no other text.
Speaking of mulligans, I think this is one of the biggest differences between, in my experience, when I play draft and when I play Constructed, is I really fail to transition from like redrawing. Like I keep such bad Constructed hands because I'm just like, oh, I keep everything and these cards are all powerful, so it's fine. Because my default is to just keep, because you need an excellent reason to mulligan in a game of Limited. I mean, if your hand is in any way functional, if it has a 2-drop that you can play, like unless your hand is 6 sigils and that 2-drop, you should probably be keeping that hand. In terms of redraw, the only real question, I think that people redraw a little optimistically in draft. Like they'll look at their hand and say, oh, well, it's not perfect. I don't have a removal spell. And so they'll redraw. The only question is whether or not, in Constructed, it's whether or not it enacts your game plan or can interact with your opponent. In limited, it's really just, is this hand in any way functional at all? And if it is, you keep 7 cards. Because if you mulligan, your win percentage just falls off a cliff. And it's much harder in limited to make up that disadvantage just because the cards are worse. So make sure that you're transitioning from a constructed mindset to a limited mindset when it comes to mulligan decisions.
Yes, and with all that said, just be sure you don't hit the concede button, right? Sometimes the green button says concede on it. Make sure you don't hit it if it says concede. All right, let's talk about pauses. This is something in limited that can really give you a huge edge. If you are very good at detecting what your opponent's pause is based on the amount of power they have available, the amount of influence they have, and when they do and don't have pauses, you can tell what fast spell they have. For example, if they have a pause when they have 3 power up, but they didn't have a pause last turn when they had 2 power up, you can probably guess that these fast spell that they have costs 3, whatever it may be. Or, for example, if someone has a pause on 1 when they play, Justice Sigil as their first card and pass, then you know exactly what faction their fast spell is. Now, granted, they can have multiple fast spells, and there's some, smokes and mirrors that can happen with this that makes it not entirely foolproof. But if you can figure out what your opponent's fast spell is, you can prepare for it, and that will give you a huge advantage.
Yeah, the obvious constructed analogy, the one that should be one of the most obvious pauses in the world, is if your opponent plays a undepleted primal source turn 1, and then they pass to you, and then you do whatever you do, and then you pass back. At the end of your turn, you see a pause, and you know that that's almost 100% of the time going to be transposed, right? Like, this is something that most constructed players should be aware of at this point. And this is something you ought to look forward to in limited a lot more, because in many ways it's even more important in limited than constructed, right? You don't really want to run into transpose and constructed, but in the end, transpose will exist, and it's gonna give them base at some point, anyways, right? So you gotta want to, but it's gonna happen. But in limited, you gotta know: does my opponent have this finest hour? Do they have the martial efficiency? Do they have the mighty strikes? Do they have a stun spell? What other pauses could that be? Is it just maybe there's some sort of card draw spell in limited that instead you gotta try to guess what their pause is, and looking for the pauses, analyzing the pause is a great way to up your limited game.
It's really important, not only because, honestly, paying attention to the pauses in limited, I think you could, draft as just for fun, and you could be very successful on the Eternal Ladder without paying too much attention to it. But if you want to play in a tournament, if you want to play at the top levels, you need to pay very close attention to the pauses, because not only can it help you figure out what's in your opponent's hand, but when you're playing against high-level opponents, when you're playing against the 2020 draft champion Gunnar, you're sending him signals. You are giving him information about what is in your hand based on the pauses, and the elite drafters are going to recognize those things. And, some of the fast spells, you can only target their units or your units, and so the pause will only occur on certain turns, and it can lead to some weird gameplay where, if you don't want your opponent to know that you have a fast spell in hand, maybe you play something pre-combat that you typically wouldn't, but then it raises the question of why did they play that pre-combat? So when you're playing against, the high-level drafters, you are sending them information with your pauses. You can set up traps, you can represent things. They will do the same to you, make you represent Grizzly Contest or something like that. So yeah, not only will it help you figure out what's in your opponent's hand, it's something that if you want to compete at the highest level, you have to think about your own pauses and what information you're giving your opponent.
So the next step, once you figured out what your opponent has, is to set up a trap for it. So I've mentioned this a few times before, and it takes some explanation because it's not like calling it a trap doesn't make it abundantly clear what is going on. But if your opponent is, say, attacking you with the 2/2 into your 3/3, you can either call their bluff and just block, and they'll probably have the fast spell, because otherwise why did they attack their 2/2 into your 3/3? But what you can do is, if you have some sort of fast removal spell or a combat trick of your own, you can take the damage and then set it up so that you can respond to their trick with your own trick or with a removal spell to pick up a 2-for-1. And usually the tempo swing created by a trap like this is so big that it will determine the game a lot of the time, because it's just a blowout with regards to amount of power spent, cards used, and everything. So that's something to get in the habit of doing. Is if someone is just attacking you, you know they have a finest hour, you can do something like set up a double block that you need to do. They use the finest hour to try to blow out your double block, and then you use your trick or whatever it is, or removal, in order to take out their unit, and then all of a sudden you're really far up on just about everything. So yeah, learn to set up traps once you know what your opponent has.
And sometimes it's important to recognize that the margins, between winning and losing are incredibly small. So chances are, if you're playing against elite competition, you're not going to be able to just completely nullify whatever their combat trick or removal spell is. Sometimes the best you can do is, try to set up combat on a future turn so that, they use the trick, but it's less devastating for you. Maybe you double block with 2 units that you didn't really care about. So often, really great players are not just going to, they see these traps coming, and sometimes it's just a matter of, if they have the trick in their hand, they're going to have it in their hand next turn. How do I minimize how awful this is going to be?
Yeah, and sometimes all you can do is deter a good player from continuing their attack with their 2/2 into your 3/3 or whatever they're doing. But, sometimes that's the best you get, and just deterring them might be good enough in itself.
I actually had a question for the two of you about intuitive play, because when it comes to playing around with pauses and traps and representing tricks, sometimes both players know what signal is sent. They know exactly what's going on, and there's no real way to tell if they have it in their hand or not. And you just kind of have to decide, if you're going to make them have it. And so I'm wondering how much the two of you rely on intuitive play to kind of make those decisions when you play constructed.
So intuitive play as in figuring out whether they have it or not, I usually call.
Like when you say I'm not sure why, but it really feels like they have this. It really just, I don't know why, but it really feels like they have this in their hand. Do you kind of trust that instinct?
I mean, there are different levels of that. I've definitely been way too cautious, and it's cost me in the past. But there are some times where I am absolutely sure that opponent will have something, and then I'll actually play around it. But I think that's not very frequent.
It's silly to say, but I play to win, and I play to what I think is my best chance of winning. And if my best chance of winning is playing around something that I think is likely, I will try to play around it. But if I think that it's not likely they have it, or my best chance of winning is just make them have it, right? Sonny played a tournament where he had mono fire, and he just made them play the hailstorm, and they didn't have hailstorm, and they just died. One of my common refrains when I play is, I'm well, especially if you specifically a good example is versus mock combo, right? I'm playing the last Expedition Open, which happened recently. I brought a Tessa deck. I brought a line of Tesseract, and during day 1, I played against mock combo a couple of times, and there were many turns up until turn 6 where I'm not going to keep open power, right? I can hold open Display of Menace or Condemn, but I'm my way to win is I got to play a crafty occultist on the board. I got to play some 1/1s on the board because I got to beat down. And if they mock combo me on turn 5, I lose. If not, I think I'm in good shape. So maybe they have it and I lose, but I'm not going to play around it because I'm going to play to win. And eventually, if my board gets large enough, I'll hold open some power and try to have some tricky interaction. But until that point, until turn 5, turn 6, probably turn 6 even, I have to play the board because I have to play to my out, and my out is that they don't beat me on turn 5.
I know that personally. I used to, during gameplay, try to kind of beat everything. So in limited something like Grizzly Contest, or in constructed something like Hailstorm. And what I think about now is I used to lose the games where they had Hailstorm, and I used to lose the games where they didn't have Hailstorm because I would just play around it. And so now that's what I think about. I'm just going to lose this game either way, so I might as well just make them have it if I can't beat it.
I say, c'est la vie, the die is cast. You go well, if they have the equalize, I lose, but otherwise I'm in good shape. Because if they have the equalize, you lose anyways, and they don't have the equalize, you lose if you don't play out to the board, as you said. So I like to make them have it oftentimes, but if I'm up advantage enough, then I try to play around it if I can, right? But I play to win.
Speaking of making them have it, I think in limited, you should definitely make them have it a lot of the time. Like if you're going for a pump spell on an unblocked attacker and you're worried about something, whether or not you should do the pump spell for the victory, I think it's worth it to go for it more often than not. Almost all the time, actually, unless you are 100% sure you're about to get blown out. And that's because, limited decks aren't good. I mean, like a good limited deck is nothing compared to a constructed deck. So they're not going to have great fast removal, right? Most of their cards are going to be units. I mean, like if you are taking a line, well, this wins, but it's dead to a removal spell if they top deck it. Well, most of their deck is a mix of power and units, probably like 90% of the deck. So they'll have like 4 removal spells or something like that, 4 hard removal spells if in a good deck or something like that. So if you take a line that dies to a removal spell but wins against anything else, that's generally a good line to take, even if you get blown out some of the time.
It feels real bad that 10% of the time, but you're right.
Another form of make them have it is like we both have, the 3/3 Mandrake with no text in play. And they're on the play, you're on the draw, and you're tapped out. It's their turn 4, and they attack with their 3/3 Mandrake. You should just block most of the time, because if they play a combat trick, they're disrupting their turn 4 significantly. They can't play a 4-drop anymore, especially in a format with a bunch of amplify cards. Going for these, early blocks, making them have it, means that they can't amplify in the future, so they can't get their 2-for-1s even. It's better to make them play the combat trick early than late.
Yeah, I'm a really big fan of just making the level 0 plays, which I talk about all the time, especially in limited.
Yeah, the thing is, especially if you're new to limited, which again, we're assuming most of you listeners are this week, it's better to make the level 0 play, right? Once you have the experience, that's when you can start trying to get clever. But basically, the times to get clever are very few and far between. They're statistical outliers. They're the 2% edge cases, and even in the 2% edge cases, if you still make the level 0 play in the edge scenario, it probably will still be fine. It's probably not going to lose you the game to still make the level 0 play, even in the slim scenario. So just basically stick to the level 0 play.
I know that earlier, like when I came back to Magic and just started drafting again, I lost a lot of games to myself. When like I knew every trick in every format, and so I just tried to play around everything, and I just lost a lot of games to myself. And now I'm, just use all my power, make my opponent have it. So I definitely play very differently now, but I did play that way where I tried to beat everything, which you just cannot do.
All right, so just to reiterate how to play once you're in the game, keep aggressively, generally compared to constructed. Plunder, you generally want to plunder away your power in the late game in order to get troves, but of course, don't bend over backwards to do that. And still make plays that make sense. If you need the unit, just play the unit. Make sure you are good at detecting your opponent's pauses and figuring out what they are, and when you do, set up traps in order to capitalize on them, and finally make them have it, because limited decks are not very good, generally speaking. All right, let's talk about the preparation going into draft tournaments. I know it might seem like you just show up and you get your cards and then you just play with those cards and that's what it is. But there's a lot of preparation that should go into limited tournaments in order to maximize your chances of doing well. And the one that takes the most amount of time, quite frankly, but is still useful, is to be versed in every single archetype that the draft format has to offer. So make sure that you're drafting not just one deck every single time. When the tournament comes around, you're not guaranteed to be able to force it. So being able to be flexible and have knowledge of the different archetypes and be able to adapt to what you're given is a really big skill. So, when you're preparing, don't always draft that monotime deck, even if it wins you a lot of games. Try lots of different things. And so when the tournament comes around, you're prepared to do just about anything.
One of the things that people like, oh, I'm just good at drafting, whatever. But I do better when I don't have experience in the set, and it's just you kind of need to get experience in the set, because every draft is a little bit different, right? Like for example, Mighty Strikes, as I said before, right? That was an insane card in a previous format, but it's just not anywhere near as astronomically good as it was back in the day. And so if you just remember back in the day it being great, you might play incorrectly. And of course, when you draft every archetype, it's also giving you experience in the game. And that's really relevant too, because one of the keys about draft is that, unlike constructed, where you can if you play enough games constructed, you know what's going to happen. You know the patterns the opponents are going to play, right? Situations are always going to be a little different, But like, you know how four faction sling works. You know what's going to happen. You know how all these decks are going to function. In draft, every game's a little bit different. Every draft's a little bit different because these decks are a unique collection of cards that have never been put together, basically, right? So it's very hard to have the same situation come up in draft. You know, you have very similar ones, but all the cards are all slightly different, and that can be tricky to play with if you don't have experience with the cards.
Keeping things in perspective, like I know not everyone has the time to draft every archetype and try it out. I want to say there's a lot that you can learn from your opponents. Like, there are some days where I get more tilted than others after losses, but really, win or lose, like the limited decks that your opponent is playing against you are really good learning opportunities. And also, so I am the type of person who advocates for drafting the hard way, which requires that you know every archetype in the format. But it also helps so much in game, because when you see your opponent's two factions and you know what a good version of that deck looks like, you know what its plan is and what cards it likely has, it makes it much easier to game plan against that deck. And then if they don't have a good version of it, well, then you're just kind of on easy mode. But when you have experience with every archetype, not only can you draft it at the table, but then it helps you to game plan in game when you have a mental framework for what your opponent's deck looks like when there's a good version of it.
I do think there are formats where it is more correct to force than others. During the Mighty Strikes format, I think just forcing the Mighty Strikes deck every time was not a bad call. You know, this format, the upcoming one, is not one of them. This is not a format where you just force a deck and get there every time.
Yeah, agreed. Like, I would be in pack one slamming Bannerman over Mighty Strikes in this format, certainly every time. There are formats where that is correct. For the upcoming tournament, I think it's definitely more correct to stay as open as possible, because there are a lot of tokens. There's a lot of seats in pack one. So it's easier in this format than most to stay open, because there are so many fixers.
Going back to something that Schaab mentioned a little earlier, about learning from your opponents. So when you draft a deck, you get to play between 3 and 9 games with the deck, right? So each time that you draft, you get to see between 3 to 9 other decks. So you'll see a lot more of your opponent's decks than you will your decks. And we mentioned earlier that everyone thinks they're great at draft. Everyone thinks that their opponent is just trash and got really lucky or whatever, right? But it pays off to really pay attention to what your opponent is doing and think about how well their deck is functioning based on the cards that they chose to put in their deck. You can take that and use it in the future in order to build your own limited draft decks and make them better. That information is extremely helpful. So, I mean, this is two things, right? One is your opponent is not trash. You are not great at draft. I mean, maybe you are, but like, you're not infallible. Certainly, you're not. There's a lot of improvement to be made. This goes back to my "Everyone is Trash" episode, but you can learn a lot from your opponents, and I think that's an opportunity that a lot of people pass up on because they're just too proud to do so or something.
Yeah, I mean, when I lose, I'm, on my bad days, I can lose to something that my opponent does with commons and uncommons, and I go, oh, this is ridiculous how lucky my opponent got, blah blah blah. But on my better days, I go, oh, like, that's how you do that. I wonder if I can draft that consistently. So you're just much better off assuming that your opponent is doing things on purpose, because if they're doing things just kind of haphazardly, well, you're going to beat those opponents anyway.
Well, if you're as good as you think you are. I went to a chess camp when I was young, and one of the things that really stuck with me is that the person running the camp always said, when you play chess, there's always a winner and there's a learner. And if you can take that mentality in your draft, I think that's really going to help when, deck lists aren't something that's a useful thing to have, because, who cares what the deck, I don't know, I guess you can't say who cares what the deck list is, but it's not like you can copy someone's deck list as you can in Constructed. The other big thing that you can do to prepare for a tournament like this, or for a draft tournament, is to have a really in-depth knowledge of all the fast spells there are. We talked about being able to sniff out what cards your opponents have based on what pauses they have. And being able to do that is only possible if you have a good knowledge of all of the fast spells. So I recommend, just taking a look at all the cards that are available in these draft packs, all the cards that are available in Expedition, even the ones that aren't necessarily very good, because, there are situations where Detain is an incredible card, even if it's, not as good as Finest Hour. And it's useful to know when that's what your opponent has. So do some research on all of the fast spells in the format.
One thing that I think can be very helpful while preparing is knowing where there's redundancy on the curve for each of the factions. So like for Justice, in the 3-drop slot, there are 3 very good playable 3-drops. There's the 2/1 flyer with regen, there's Stayer's Beckoning, and there's the 2/2 that stuns. And so each of those cards are better in some decks, but your win percentage isn't going to alter all that much based on which one of those 3-drops you have on your curve. But there are some colors, like Fire doesn't have that many 2-drops, and so that's not a very replaceable spot on Fire's curve. And so knowing where there's redundancy within each faction can help with your draft process, especially knowing what units are in packs 2 and 3 as opposed to pack 4 can be helpful in making those choices, because sometimes you can fill out your curve in pack 4 with 2-drops or interaction or whatever you're expecting to see, but sometimes they're just not there. So knowing where your factions are deep can especially help in packs 2 and 3 when you get to pack 4 and it's time to fill out the rest of your curve.
Yeah, that's good advice. It's really weird when there's just like a ton of options at one spot in the curve for one faction. Like, I don't know. I think it's weird design of the format when that happens, but it's a fact of life. It happens sometimes. Sometimes, hypothetically, Fire 4-drops are really easy to come by. There's a lot at common. They're all really good. Then you don't need to pick them quite as highly because you'll probably get one later on.
Yeah, it's just a good general draft guideline that anything redundant you don't need to take too highly.
Yeah. All right, so when you're preparing for a tournament, make sure that you know what cards are in the draft format, both for fast spells and knowing how to fill out your curve, and that you have a good sense for how to draft each archetype, because you might be in a situation where you have to draft something that you don't necessarily want to, like Stormblessed did last year in the top 8 of the draft tournament. All right, let's go on to other miscellaneous tips that we might have. My big one is to slow down. I mean, I say this all the time. People play way too fast. They also draft way too fast. Make sure that you really take in everything there is in the pack, because there might be a card that you're not used to looking at and thinking of as a good card, but upon further consideration, it works well with your deck, or just being able to get a better sense of what the signals are. I think people like drafting fast because you can just go draft. You can pick up all the cards in like 5 minutes if you really want to. But if you're trying to play really well, I think you need to take a really long time, especially for the first, 2 or 3 packs, 2.5 packs. After that, you can maybe go on autopilot a bit more. The decisions are a little easier. But yeah, slow down. That's my big tip.
Absolutely. We have asynchronous drafting for a reason. We're not the MTG style of drafting where you have to pick a card because you have to pass the pack over to your person on your left. You can't stall the game down too much, and you have timers if you're playing it online. This is asynchronous, so take the time that you're given, and it will work out for you. Trust me. You can spend 5 minutes on a single pick, and it won't be a problem.
I would guess that the slow down advice probably applicable to 95 to 98% of Eternal players, myself included. It's just unnecessary rushing just leads to more mistakes, which is what I wanted to talk about. There was a great thread from, I think, the Boxer on Twitter about some gameplay advice, and one of the last things they said really resonated with me, and that's that more games are determined by like mistakes, by poor decisions, than they are by like incredible, fancy, big brain plays. And when I think back in my own experience, that rings so true. Like I can think of all these games where I just made these inexplicable little mistakes because I was going too quickly or just wasn't thinking. And those things are far more likely to have an effect on the game than, reinventing the wheel and figuring something out for the first time in game. So a lot of it is not making mistakes, slowing down, and just double checking yourself. Because yeah, a mistake is much more likely to cost you than coming up with some incredible line.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. We saw that all over the Throne ECQ. That's mistakes determine games. Try to minimize your mistakes.
Okay, so as always, I'm going to end the cast by discussing important dates in the future. So the dates to remember are, the next two TNEs are a little bit out. They are on April 23rd and 27th, and they are both XBED. So I assume most of you will take some decks or inspiration from the Expedition Open, the deck lists that are now out. And then beyond that, obviously with the Direwolf sponsored tournaments themselves, we have the Draft Open that is happening very shortly. It's happening on April 30th to May 2nd. So hopefully I will see some of you there because it should be a great time. And then after that, we have the Throne Open on June 11th to June 13th. And somewhere between there, we are expecting set 11, a full big set. So we'll see if Direwolf delivers on that sort of implication from the timeline.
And as always, we would like to thank our patrons for making this episode and all episodes of FECast possible. So we have a couple new/old patrons this week. I should say returning patrons this week. So a huge thank you to Alcide Bava and Cotillion, who have previously been patrons and are now patrons again. And thank you to our returning patrons of Odzos, Prewibin, Rick Dunson, Camomel, Chrissier, D-Dub, and Yeastout for their continued support of FECast. And finally, a huge thank you to SRFS, who makes our lives easier so we can focus on what to talk about and not like how to get FECast out to everyone, everywhere, you know what I'm saying, for all of their continued work in the Eternal community. Thank you so much for joining us, Schaab. Just a reminder, if you haven't checked out Schaab's writing, you definitely should. We'll have links in the description, but you can find them all linked at letstalklimited.com. Schaab, any last words before we say goodbye to our listeners?
Just thanks again for having me on. I know it sounds so cheesy, but try to have a good time when in the draft tournament. It's a delicate balance trying to feel loose and play tight, but that's really what you want to go for. These games are supposed to be fun. I often have to remind myself of that. So yeah, just have a good time and happy drafting.
Thank you all for listening. We'll be back next week with an in-depth look at the Stormbreak draft format with at least one person who is very familiar with it. So look forward to that if you're looking for advice specifically for the tournament that's coming up. All right, until next time, we will see you in the friend zone. Goodbye. The Friends of Eternal Discord is the best place on the internet to get better at Eternal. We have players of all skill and experience levels all happy to help each other out on basically any aspect of their Eternal gameplay. And making all this possible is our generous patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support FECast or Friends of Eternal, consider donating at patreon.com/Friends of Eternal. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, we'll see you in the Friend Zone.